Proficiency 6, Literature for Children and Adolescents. Andy, I killed my friend because all we wanted was some nice, cold beer in the back of my car, the car I drove into a wall, where my best friend burned and screamed. Darcy, should I tell someone? Dad just got back and now he and Ma fighting again. About what? I don't know. Missing Gran, the only one I could talk to. I'm too scared. Gemma, what have I got to run away from? Bloody hell. There's Ta beat up, in love with me. Mum and Dad forbid our relationship. I'm so bored in school, almost dizzy with it. Maybe, just maybe, I'll go. What you just heard were 3 improvisation monologues written about 3 different characters from novels that I've had my own students in the past read. This is an exercise that gets a person into the mind of a character, and it's used in order to build sympathy and empathy. Today I use it as an introduction to the novels themselves. Darcy, the main character of Summer of Secrets, was the second one that you heard. Summer of Secrets is part of a series called the Bluford series, one of the authors being Paul Langwin. The third book, Smack by Melvin Burgess, features actually the 2 perspectives of both Gemma and Tar, and I chose to write an improvisation monologue on Gemma. Several years ago, I worked at an alternative school for students who were at risk of not graduating from high school. Several of them had not really been readers or would label themselves readers. In order to entice them to read, we had a series of choice books, and I decided that I wanted them originally to work in lit circles, but because we didn't let the students take the books home, we had to let them read at school, and that actually was to their advantage. So it became more of a choice novel unit, and I called it The Novel. They were given choices of young adult novels. 3 of the books you've seen were just a microcosm of the huge amount that we had. The books were high interest and low complexity. These are all struggling readers that I worked with, so the low complexity part was important, but the high interest was very important too. As we all know, young adult novels often deal with teen social issues like gangs, friends, AODA use, pregnancy, etc. Real social issues that students are involved in and they want to read. This really centered around this idea of engagement in reading, that students will want to read because they're engaged in what they're reading. Gay Ivy, an author that we read a little bit about this semester, is a huge proponent of this piece, and I really go to her now, especially as the theorist, to back up my ideas on engagement in reading. The really important part about what I was doing was that I gave my students a choice, and I told them that, here are your books, and you can choose what you wanted to read, and they did. They also worked on active reading strategies. I borrowed a former colleague's concept of a think book, and I had students respond in notebooks after creating their think books with questions and comments. And then I went back in and I looked at them and I commented on them as well. This past semester, spring semester of 2013, I was subbing for a local English teacher who was on maternity leave in a class where they used what they called literary circles. The literary circles were heavily based on a literary theory, in this case, post-apocalyptic literary theory. The students were given specific roles, even had role sheets, and duties that drove the conversations. For instance, the quote gatherer had to find quotes significant to themes and motifs that they had been talking about. There was a connector, and the connector had to specifically look for post-apocalyptic elements, existentialism, allegory, and symbolism. So it was heavily directed in what they needed to talk about and what they needed to look for. And I think even though we call them lit circles, the fact that they were really literary circles really points to how still teacher directed they were in terms of being very academic. The hard part was that I really grappled with this. I admired what the teachers at this high school had done because it was such an academic conversation. And by the end of that unit, the students knew what post-apocalyptic literature was. They could recognize it in different texts. They could talk about existentialism and symbolism and allegory, very much these higher order thinking skills in our discipline. But I was still concerned because I don't think the students came away with this idea of reading for enjoyment. It was very much reading as a means to get information or to just, why am I taking this class? Because you have to graduate because you need this credit. So that was very frustrating for me. I had the opportunity this summer or that semester rather, to take a look at literature circles and redefine again my idea of that engaged reading. Harvey Daniels' Literature Circles, Voice and Choice in book clubs and reading groups is really the seminal text for literature circles. Some of the things that he is a proponent of is that independent reading is central to a reading curriculum. So we really need to encourage that independent reading. Literature circles are to create classroom community, and that was one of the main problems I had when working with these literary circles with the post-apocalyptic groups, was that they had their roles and they would complete them and they would be done. Because their roles were done, the conversation didn't become as organic. Sometimes it did, because you'd have students who were more skilled at that, but the ones who were less skilled, it was often a stilted conversation. It didn't really go anywhere. And I believe that having more engaged reading in classes would help facilitate, especially those last two, that creating that classroom community and that organic conversation that you can apply to the more academic texts that we study. By this point, one may be wondering, why then would I include these literary circles as an artifact in my proficiency? The reason being is that it brought me to a crossroads in my thinking about engaged reading and literature circles, because as the more and more I looked at it, I came to realize that I don't think that you can cannibalize such an awesome teaching strategy such as literature circles and make them as academic and gain the same benefits. I think those become two very separate things. I think you can use some of the tenets of literature circles to talk about academic books, but it can't be the only time you do that. I believe you do need that engaged reading as well happening at the same time, so that students know and understand how that organic conversation works. And so I'm including this artifact because it shows what challenges I've had as a teacher and how that thought process has come along. Now that I have my own classroom, where does this bring me? Well, I'm a bit in a curriculum that's more or less fixed, and we have to be done with the book that we're on by the end of the semester. Mainly because of scheduling, actually. We don't determine scheduling, the counselors do, and when the kids switch that semester, they switch. I'll have hardly any of the students I had first semester as I will next semester. So we do need that consistency among the English 9 department. So when we continue with our reading strategies and the other things that we're teaching, writing strategies too, we know where the students are coming from, so we can make those connections to texts that we made earlier, because we're working with the theme of identity. So I really have been trying to find other ways to encourage engaged reading, and it's an experiment. I don't know how well it's working. We'll see towards the end of the year. Right now, about once a week, I grab a young adult novel or two, and I read 5 minutes from one for one class, and then 5 minutes from one for the other class, and then I'll switch the next week. And I've had a few students check out my books, which has been really nice. Just, 3, but it's something. And I think it's a start. I also have implemented what I call the weekly reader using a Google form. Funnily enough, though, most students like to do it on paper as opposed to doing the electronic link. I send them through their email. And I wanted to recognize their multiliteracies, a term and concept I got from Jill Castick this summer, because a lot of their reading is online, and I do want them to recognize it. I do a lot of online reading too. And, if they're reading blogs, if they're reading articles, I wanted to recognize that and say, hey, look, you're reading. This is reading. I wish it were a bit longer pieces of reading they're doing, but right now it's at least something. And we can hopefully work on to that longer reading, the books and the longer articles and stuff. And maybe they'll never read a book again for fun, but I hope that's not the case. And so that's why I have this second artifact here. I'm really standing as a reading teacher and saying that these kids need to get into engaged reading. We need to engage them, not just teach them. We have to do both. We have to teach them how to read, and we have to teach them our discipline, in this case, English language arts, and how one is apprentice in this discipline. And if we don't do that, then we're stuck.